Some American cars were so terrible you'd think they were jokes, but they were painfully real. From ugly designs to engines that died after a few miles, these machines proved that not every Detroit dream was a good one. They rattled, leaked, broke, and embarrassed anyone brave enough to drive them. Here are the 10 ultra-worst American cars you won't believe were actually real. The 1976 Cadillac Seville diesel was one of those moments in automotive history when a company so obsessed with keeping up with trends forgot who it really was. For decades, Cadillac had symbolized American luxury, power, silence, and smoothness, the kind of car that seemed to glide rather than drive. But by the mid-1970s, with oil crises, fuel shortages, and new emissions regulations strangling the industry, even Cadillac felt the pressure to appear economical. Their answer was not refinement or innovation, it was desperation. They decided to stuff a diesel engine, borrowed from Oldsmobile, into one of their most refined sedans. The result wasn't progress, it was a catastrophe, dressed in fine leather and chrome. The Seville itself, when introduced, had been something of a success story. It was Cadillac's first compact luxury car, intended to attract younger, more fuel-conscious buyers while retaining an air of prestige. Its crisp styling, inspired by European sedans, gave it a fresh identity compared to the bloated cruisers of the era. The interior was lush, the suspension tuned for comfort, and the badge still carried an aura of wealth and achievement. But when Cadillac decided to drop in Oldsmobile's 350 cubic inch diesel V8, a hastily re-engineered gasoline engine converted for diesel use, the dream started to rot from the inside out. That engine was a mechanical disaster. Designed during a panic for better fuel economy, it was never properly engineered to handle the immense pressures of diesel combustion. The result was catastrophic failure on almost a legendary scale. The head bolts were too few and too weak, leading to blown head gaskets and cracked blocks. The injection system leaked, the fuel pump failed regularly, and the car's performance was an embarrassment. It produced a pathetic 120 horsepower, barely enough to move the nearly 2-ton Seville with any dignity. From a stoplight, it wheezed forward with all the urgency of a dying lawnmower. Once running, it belched smoke, rattled like a bucket of bolts, and shook the steering wheel in your hands. The Cadillac that once symbolized silence now clattered like a farm tractor begging for mercy. Owners quickly realized they had bought a nightmare. Many engines failed before hitting 20,000 miles. Mechanics struggled to keep them running, and dealerships grew so accustomed to complaints that they started replacing entire engines under warranty, sometimes multiple times for the same customer. One owner, in a bitter letter to General Motors, wrote, "I bought a Cadillac because I thought it represented the best of America. Instead, I bought the loudest, weakest, most unreliable piece of junk I've ever owned." Others said they were afraid to take long trips because they never knew if the car would make it home. Diesel fuel itself was hard to find in urban areas then, and when they did refuel, they faced clogged filters, frozen lines, and hard starts in cold weather. The sound was another insult. A proper Cadillac was supposed to whisper, to cocoon its passengers from the outside world, but the Seville diesel betrayed that tradition entirely. It rattled, coughed, and groaned so loudly that owners had to raise their voices during conversation. It had all the refinement of a city bus. What made the insult worse was the price. These were not cheap cars. Buyers paid premium money for what they believed was luxury, and instead they received an engineering afterthought with a gold crest glued to the hood. The public humiliation was swift and merciless. The car that once symbolized the American dream had become a punchline. Cadillac Diesel became shorthand for failure, a name whispered in the same breath as Edsel and Vega. Mechanics joked that Diesel Seville stood for "doesn't ever start" in every location. Even loyal Cadillac customers began to drift away, disgusted that the company would sacrifice its core values for a few miles per gallon. The car's resale value plummeted faster than almost any other vehicle of its time. To make matters worse, the fuel economy gains, the very reason for the diesel's existence, weren't even impressive. Most owners reported around 20 miles per gallon, barely better than a standard gasoline Seville, and far worse when the engine started to degrade.
Reliability was so poor that the costs of repairs often surpassed whatever fuel savings the car provided. Cadillac tried to defend its experiment by claiming it was ahead of its time, but few believed it. It wasn't just a poor decision, it was a betrayal of what Cadillac had stood for since its inception: silent power, smooth performance, and mechanical excellence. Today, the 1976 Cadillac Seville diesel is remembered not for innovation, but as a warning. It marked the moment when America's greatest luxury automaker lost its way, chasing trends instead of setting them. Enthusiasts look back on it as a tragic example of what happens when brand pride bows to panic. A handful of these cars still exist, many converted back to gasoline engines by frustrated owners, but they are reminders of a time when even the mighty Cadillac stumbled. As one bitter former owner once said, "It was a Cadillac in name only. On the outside, it whispered luxury. Under the hood, it screamed for help." And perhaps that sums it up best. A car that tried to be elegant, but ended up as one of the noisiest, most humiliating chapters in Cadillac history.
The 1982 Chevrolet Citation X11 was supposed to be General Motors' answer to the rising tide of sporty, compact, front-wheel drive cars from Japan and Europe. A car that combined efficiency, style, and a hint of excitement. On paper, it sounded promising. A hatchback with a lower, more aggressive stance, upgraded suspension, and a sportier interior, all carrying the X11 badge that was meant to signify performance. But in reality, the Citation X11 was a masterclass in disappointment, a car that promised thrills but delivered frustration, danger, and near immediate depreciation. Underneath its sharply styled body lurked the same underwhelming architecture that plagued the base Citation. GM's X-Body platform was lightweight and economical, but it wasn't engineered for sport. The suspension, though stiffened slightly for the X11, was crude and prone to collapse under hard cornering. Drivers reported unsettling body roll and instability at highway speeds, as if the car were balancing precariously on its own hubcaps. Steering was vague and inconsistent, making high-speed maneuvers feel like a guessing game, an unpleasant combination when paired with the car's tendency to understeer or snap over the limit. On wet or uneven pavement, the X11 could suddenly feel unmoored, leaving even cautious drivers scrambling to regain control. The brakes, another weak point, could barely keep up with the vehicle's mass, particularly after repeated stops. Drum brakes on earlier models often faded catastrophically during normal driving, turning what should have been a manageable highway stop into a tense, unpredictable ordeal. Disc brakes on later models offered some improvement, but not nearly enough to restore confidence. Owners frequently found themselves having to plan braking zones well in advance, a tedious requirement for a car marketed as sporty and fun. GM's quality control woes only amplified the misery. Rust was a nearly universal problem, appearing in wheel wells, undercarriages, and door sills almost as soon as the car rolled off the lot. Electrical gremlins, interior wear, and trim pieces falling off became so common that the X11 quickly gained a reputation for being high maintenance and humiliating to own. A car intended to be a status symbol in the compact sports segment instead became a running joke among consumers and mechanics alike. Power, too, was underwhelming. Most X11s came with GM's 2.8-liter V6, rated at a modest 112 horsepower, hardly enough to compensate for the car's handling and brake deficiencies. Acceleration was sluggish, especially compared to the nimble imports it was meant to compete against. The car struggled to maintain momentum up hills, and the weak engine paired with the front-wheel drive layout could easily overwhelm the tires, producing torque steer under heavy acceleration. Enthusiasts, hoping for an American answer to the sporty hatchback dream, were met with a wheezing, unstable, and lifeless machine that delivered neither speed nor confidence. The interior, while slightly upgraded from base models, did little to mitigate the car's flaws.
Seats offered minimal support, the dash layout was functional but uninspiring, and the overall cabin felt cheap compared to both imported rivals and the expectations set by the X11 branding. Drivers were left with the ironic sensation that they had purchased a car that looked faster than it actually was, sounded more aggressive than it actually felt, and handled worse than almost any other contemporary GM offering. Owner accounts from the era are filled with frustration. One recalled, "It was like driving a cardboard box on springs. Every bump shook you, the steering was vague, and you had to pray the brakes worked when you needed them." Another summed it up perfectly. GM tried to make a sporty hatchback and ended up with something that embarrassed everyone involved, including the buyers. The X11 name, meant to denote performance and sophistication, instead became synonymous with mediocrity, mechanical frustration, and rusting humiliation. Ultimately, the 1982 Chevrolet Citation X11 serves as a stark reminder of a period when GM was struggling to compete with imports, but leaned on cost-cutting and rushed engineering rather than innovation or quality. It promised sport and excitement, but delivered instability, mechanical failure, and an almost immediate loss of prestige. While it has some nostalgic recognition today, collectors generally view it as a cautionary tale, a car that aimed high but crashed spectacularly before it even left the driveway. In short, the Citation X11 was a car that tried to be thrilling, only to reveal that design, quality, and engineering matter far more than a sporty badge or a lowered suspension. It was a compact disaster in every sense, a car that humiliated its drivers, frustrated mechanics, and tarnished GM's reputation in the sporty small car segment, all while masquerading as performance on paper.
The 1979 Chrysler Cordoba 300 was the epitome of late 1970s Detroit excess, a car that tried to straddle a line between traditional American luxury and the era's obsession with opulence, but ultimately delivered style without substance. Chrysler resurrected the 300 badge, a name once synonymous with performance and prestige in the 1950s and 1960s, hoping to recapture some of that glory. But what emerged was a massive land yacht that promised sophistication, yet delivered an exercise in frustration, inefficiency, and overblown design. On the outside, the Cordoba 300 looked stately, long hood, formal roofline, and a squared-off rear deck that seemed to stretch endlessly. Opera windows, wide chrome bumpers, and a bold grille hinted at grandeur, while the overall proportions made it clear that this was a car meant to dominate the boulevard rather than the racetrack. But its massive size, nearly 4,200 pounds fully loaded, was more a liability than a feature. Parking was a chore. Maneuvering through traffic felt like steering a barge, and despite its bulk, acceleration was lethargic at best. Under the hood sat a 400 cubic inch, or 6.6-liter V8, producing a mere 195 horsepower, hardly enough to motivate the car's enormous mass. In a world where muscle cars had dominated the previous decade, the Cordoba 300 felt painfully underpowered, lumbering and sluggish, as if the engine were apologizing for the car's sheer size. Inside, Chrysler's idea of luxury was a mixture of faux refinement and cost-cutting masquerade. Plush velour seats and imitation wood trim were paired with plastic chrome accents that rattled with the slightest road imperfection. The dashboard was long and impressive in appearance, but beneath the veneer, it was a house of rattles, squeaks, and loose fittings. Owners often remarked that the interior sounded like a baby's toy box rolling down the street, a constant reminder that the Cordoba's promise of refinement was mostly cosmetic. Even the air conditioning and power accessories, intended to convey sophistication, often failed or struggled, making the luxurious aura feel hollow. Handling was predictably ponderous. The car's length and weight, combined with soft suspension tuned for comfort rather than precision, made cornering slow, sloppy, and unnerving at higher speeds. Body roll was extreme, and the massive tires struggled to keep the car planted. Braking was another disappointment. Drum brakes, or optional front discs, could only do so much against the momentum of such a large vehicle. On wet or icy surfaces, stopping distances were long and panic maneuvers were frighteningly ineffective. The Cordoba 300, in short, rewarded careful driving and punished any enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the high-powered, nimble 300s of Chrysler's earlier muscle era. Fuel economy, predictably, was dismal. The large V8 guzzled gas as if it were running off water, making long trips expensive and urban commuting a nightmare. Combined with insurance costs and maintenance for a sprawling, complex land yacht, owning a Cordoba 300 required patience, pocketbook resilience, and a willingness to endure minor irritations. Despite these flaws, Chrysler tried to market it as a personal luxury coupe, a vehicle for drivers who wanted comfort, prestige, and presence. But in practice, the car often delivered embarrassment instead of esteem. Owner experiences from the era are full of amusement and regret. One recalled, "It looked like a Cadillac without the pedigree and drove like a sofa on wheels. You could hear every loose trim piece jiggling as you drove, and the engine sounded like it was struggling just to keep the car moving." Another summed it up perfectly. "They tried to sell us luxury, but all you got was size and noise. Every road imperfection became a concert of rattles." The Cordoba 300 was, in essence, a car of contradictions. Visually commanding, but mechanically uninspiring. Nominally luxurious, but functionally flimsy. By the end of its run, the 1979 Chrysler Cordoba 300 stood as a symbol of the automaker's 1970s identity crisis, a period of overblown designs, cost-cutting materials, and half-hearted engineering masked with badges and trim. It was a car that sought to impress, yet reminded everyone that glamour without substance is fleeting. Today, it's often remembered with a mix of nostalgia and schadenfreude, a testament to an era when American cars could be enormous, slow, and shiny all at once. A final, bloated farewell to Chrysler's most deluded dreams of the decade. The Cordoba 300 wasn't dangerous in the same visceral way as muscle cars or small, unstable coupes of the period, but it was hazardous to your pride, your wallet, and anyone foolish enough to expect performance or refinement. In every sense, it was a grand spectacle of style over substance, a car that looked powerful, moved reluctantly, and rattled relentlessly, leaving its owners to wonder why such a majestic facade had been married to such mediocre engineering. The 1980 AMC Eagle SX4 was one of the strangest and most ambitious experiments in American automotive history. A car that promised innovation but delivered eccentricity, frustration, and mechanical headaches in equal measure. AMC, always the underdog, wanted to create a vehicle that could stand out in a crowded marketplace. Part sporty coupe, part rugged off-roader. And all-wheel drive at a time when few Americans even knew what that meant. The concept was undeniably ahead of its time. In theory, you had a nimble, compact car that could tackle rain, snow, and rough roads with confidence. A predecessor to the crossovers and SUVs that would dominate decades later. In practice, the Eagle SX4 was a Frankenstein of mismatched parts, compromised engineering, and overambitious marketing. At first glance, the SX4 looked promising. AMC took the familiar two-door Hornet platform, lowered it slightly, and added an aggressive, almost European stance. It had squared-off lines, flared wheel arches, and a raised ride height that suggested capability. The all-wheel drive system, unique among American cars at the time, was a serious selling point on paper. But beneath the body, the reality was far less elegant. AMC had cobbled together leftover components from previous models, resulting in a car with inconsistent engineering. The suspension was lifted and reinforced for off-road potential, yet it remained tuned like a standard Hornet, producing a bizarre blend of floaty handling, body roll, and an unsettling high center of gravity. On corners, the car felt like a bowling ball being pushed around a tight alley. Under hard acceleration, the front end would push, and under braking, the rear would squirm unpredictably. Drivers often reported a constant feeling that the car might tip or slide at any moment, especially on wet or uneven surfaces.
The engine options didn't help the Eagle SX4's case. Buyers could choose between AMC's inline-six or small V8s, neither of which had the torque or refinement needed to manage the extra weight of the AWD system. Acceleration was sluggish, particularly with the V8, as the car's added mechanical complexities sapped power and efficiency. Shifting was often jerky, especially in early automatic models, and the drivetrain could be surprisingly loud. A reminder that this wasn't a sleek European AWD machine, but a patched-together American experiment. Maintenance became a recurring headache. Drive shafts, transfer cases, and differential components were not designed for sustained off-road abuse, and parts failures were common. Mechanics often had to improvise fixes, as parts replacement was scarce, and the system was unlike anything else on American roads at the time. Rust, too, was a relentless enemy. The Eagle SX4's body and frame were prone to corrosion, particularly around wheel arches and suspension mounting points. Many owners watched in despair as their quirky, forward-thinking coupe began to crumble within a few years of purchase. The interior, while not awful, suffered from cheap materials that rattled and squeaked, and the cabin often felt heavier and more cramped than the sporty styling suggested. What was supposed to be a spirited, all-weather coupe became a constant reminder of compromise. Heavy, slow, awkward, and increasingly fragile. Owner accounts capture both the charm and the torment of the Eagle SX4. One recalled, "It looked like it could go anywhere, but it barely handled city streets without feeling unstable. The drivetrain made all sorts of noises and you never really trusted it at speed." Another added, "I loved the idea of all-wheel drive before anyone knew what that meant, but the car would rattle, shake, and rust out faster than I could drive it anywhere. It was weird, and it knew it." These experiences underscore the SX4's duality. Imaginative and forward-thinking in concept, yet frustrating and unreliable in execution. Despite its flaws, the AMC Eagle SX4 holds a curious place in automotive history. It was arguably the first American car to blend all-wheel drive capability with a passenger-oriented coupe body, a concept that would only be refined decades later with crossovers and AWD sedans. Its quirky design, underdog pedigree, and unapologetic weirdness make it an object of fascination for enthusiasts today. Those who appreciate the Eagle SX4 see it as a pioneer, an early attempt at what would eventually become one of the most popular vehicle segments in the world. Yet, at the time, driving the Eagle SX4 was often an exercise in patience, improvisation, and tolerance for imperfection. It was a car caught between eras, too heavy to be sporty, too unconventional to be practical, and too fragile to be reliable. Its ambition exceeded its engineering, and its potential was always tempered by the realities of AMC's limited resources. The Eagle SX4 wasn't a failure in the sense of being unloved, but it was a constant challenge, a car that dared to dream bigger than it could deliver, leaving owners with a mix of admiration, frustration, and the unmistakable sense that they were piloting something utterly unique, utterly weird, and utterly unpolished. In the end, the 1980 AMC Eagle SX4 is remembered as a bold, flawed, and fascinating footnote in automotive history. A car that promised the future of all-wheel drive American vehicles, but delivered it in a shape and form that only a handful of daring drivers could truly appreciate. It was a quirky mix of ambition, compromise, and eccentricity, a vehicle that could inspire awe, irritation, or both, depending on how brave you felt behind the wheel. The 1977 Chevrolet Chevette was GM's hurried response to a very specific problem: the 1970s oil crisis and the sudden American thirst for fuel-efficient transportation. In theory, the idea was simple enough: produce a compact, economical car that could get decent mileage without breaking the bank. In practice, GM's attempt resulted in one of the most uninspiring, underpowered, and downright frustrating cars to hit U.S. streets in decades. The Chevette wasn't just basic, it felt like an insult to anyone who'd ever hoped for an engaging driving experience. At its heart was a 1.4-liter inline-4 engine, producing a meager 52 horsepower. In a car weighing over 1,800 pounds, that was barely enough to accelerate onto a highway with confidence. Drivers quickly discovered that merging or passing at speed required near-perfect timing and nerves of steel. The engine itself was a noisy, rattling affair, prone to vibration and shaking that made even calm freeway driving an endurance test. Mechanics and owners alike joked that the car sounded as though it might fall apart under its own weight, a sentiment reinforced when misfires, weak mounts, or loose components added to the cacophony. The transmission, a 4-speed manual in most models, was flimsy, with imprecise shifts and vague engagement points, further compounding the sense that the car was barely assembled for functionality, let alone performance. Comfort, or rather, the lack of it, was another Achilles heel. The Chevette's interior was Spartan, with thin, flat seats, minimal padding, and hard plastics that rattled incessantly over rough pavement. Road noise filtered directly into the cabin, making any trip longer than 20 minutes feel like punishment. Heating and ventilation systems were underpowered, and the suspension, a simple leaf spring setup, did little to mitigate bumps or potholes, creating a ride so rough that even short commutes became an exercise in endurance. A particularly rough road could rattle the Chevette so violently that drivers joked they were being massaged by the vibrations, an unintentional spa experience that few appreciated. Handling was predictably uninspiring. The car's narrow track, lightweight, and basic suspension geometry produced timid cornering, with noticeable body roll and almost no feedback through the steering. Panic maneuvers were frightening, as the front end would dart unpredictably and the rear was prone to light oversteer when pushed. Despite its small size, the Chevette felt unstable at speeds many cars of the era handled with ease. Rain or snow only amplified its shortcomings, revealing a vehicle ill-equipped for anything beyond straight-line city commuting. Reliability was a mixed bag. While some Chevettes soldiered on for years, many suffered from electrical gremlins, fuel system quirks, and mechanical wear accelerated by the light, stressed engine. The nickname, "the car that time forgot," on purpose, summed up the collective frustration. A car that seemed designed not to impress, not to endure, and certainly not to excite. Fuel economy, the supposed selling point, was better than larger sedans, but unimpressive by later compact standards, and only partially justified the sacrifices in comfort and performance. Public perception was brutal. Critics mocked the Chevette for being slow, rattly, and uninspiring, and buyers quickly realized that the fuel savings came at a steep price in quality of life behind the wheel. Owners often reported feeling embarrassed to park one alongside any car with a sense of style or purpose. It became the car equivalent of a diet soda. Functional, yes, but joyless, hollow, and unsatisfying. And yet, the Chevette did achieve one of its intended goals. It was cheap, ubiquitous, and relatively easy to maintain. Replacement parts were abundant, and its simplicity meant that a mechanically inclined owner could keep it running for years, even if the experience was painful. It became a symbol of an era when Americans were forced to compromise comfort and pride for economy. A stark reminder of how external pressures could push even the largest automakers into producing something so thoroughly uninspiring. The 1977 Chevette is remembered today as both a relic and a cautionary tale. A car that prioritized cost and fuel economy over performance, comfort, and joy. It was a tiny, rattling compromise, a car that made you question why you'd ever leave your driveway. And yet, in a way, it defined the era, embodying the awkward intersection of fuel crises, corporate expediency, and often the brutal reality of American car design when practicality outweighed pleasure. It wasn't just underpowered, It was a humbling experience, a daily reminder that sometimes saving a few gallons of gas came with a lifetime of regrets behind the wheel. The 1980 Ford Mustang II King Cobra was a peculiar and often painful chapter in Mustang history. A car that looked aggressive, promised excitement, but delivered almost none. By the late 1970s, the automotive world was in the grip of the malaise era, when emissions regulations, rising insurance costs, and fuel crises had sapped the horsepower and ambition from America's muscle cars. Ford's response was the Mustang II, a smaller, lighter, and more fuel-efficient version of the pony car legend. It was meant to attract a new generation of buyers, but it did so by sacrificing nearly everything that had made the Mustang thrilling. The King Cobra, a special edition aimed at amplifying the car's street presence, became a symbol of what went wrong. On the outside, the King Cobra looked aggressive. Ford slathered it with a massive hood decal of a coiled cobra, racing stripes, and sporty trim intended to convey menace and speed. To the casual observer, it had the visual hallmarks of a muscle car: long hood, short deck, flared fenders, and the aura of raw power. But what was hiding under the hood was a disappointment so profound it became the punchline of the era. The car's V8 engine was a 302 cubic inch 5.0-liter unit, but heavily detuned to just 139 horsepower for emissions compliance. In a car that looked ready to chew up highways, that power was laughably insufficient. Acceleration was slow and hesitant. Merging onto freeways required careful planning and patience. The King Cobra had the swagger of a predator, but the energy of a lawnmower, making every attempt at performance anticlimactic. Handling was another letdown. The Mustang II shared its chassis with the Pinto, albeit with some enhancements, meaning the suspension geometry was far from ideal for sporty driving. Cornering produced noticeable body roll, vague steering, and a general sense of instability. Even a moderately spirited drive revealed how little the chassis could cope with speed or enthusiasm. The brakes, while functional, felt overmatched for the car's length and weight, making aggressive stops feel nervous and underwhelming. Enthusiasts who expected the raw precision and feedback of earlier Mustangs were often left frustrated, or worse, disillusioned. Inside, the King Cobra was a modest step up from the base Mustang II. The interior was functional, with vinyl seats and a simple dashboard, but lacked the aura of sportiness or refinement that the exterior promised. Noise, vibration, and harshness were omnipresent, with every bump and imperfection transmitted directly to the cabin. Long drives were tiring, and the car's small size offered little comfort for taller drivers or passengers. The dichotomy between the car's wild appearance and its tame, unrefined interior was stark and often mocked by both owners and critics alike. Owner accounts from the era paint a picture of frustration mixed with reluctant amusement. One recounted, "I bought a Mustang, expecting a pony car roar and the thrill of acceleration. What I got was a car that looked fast sitting still and sounded like it was choking under the hood." Another noted, "The King Cobra decal made people stop and stare, but once you tried to drive it hard, the joke became painfully obvious." The Mustang II King Cobra was a car that invited expectation and delivered embarrassment, a clear reflection of the malaise era's constraints and the compromises automakers made to survive in an increasingly regulated and economically pressured market. Despite its failings, the Mustang II King Cobra has gained a peculiar place in automotive lore. It is simultaneously mocked and nostalgically remembered as a car that tried to preserve Mustang spirit in a time when power and performance were being systematically stripped away. Collectors today often see it as a curious artifact, a car that embodies the struggle between image and reality, ambition and regulation, style and substance. The massive hood decal and sporty styling make it visually striking, but they also serve as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, in this case, painfully so. In the end, the 1980 Mustang II King Cobra wasn't just a weak pony car. It was a symbol of a difficult period for American performance vehicles. It had the look of menace, the aura of speed, and the name to suggest power, but under the surface, it was a meek, hesitant, and ultimately underwhelming machine. The King Cobra is remembered as a car that dared to pretend, a car that looked like a predator but behaved like a domestic pet. And in the grand story of Mustang history, it serves as a cautionary tale of style over substance, marketing over mechanics, and ambition strangled by circumstance.
The 1975 Dodge Aspen was meant to be Dodge's fresh start, a compact, modern replacement for the aging Dart, designed to capture the hearts of Americans looking for practicality, style, and reliability. On paper, the Aspen seemed promising. Clean lines, multiple body styles, including coupe, sedan, and station wagon, and a choice of engines that ranged from modest inline sixes to more ambitious V8s. But the reality was a disaster from day one. Rather than being a bridge into a new era of quality, the Aspen became a symbol of Detroit's decline in the mid-1970s. A car plagued by mechanical failures, shoddy construction, and a near-pathological susceptibility to rust. Rust was perhaps the Aspen's most infamous trait. The car's body panels and frame were prone to corrosion almost immediately, especially in the wheel wells, underbody, and around door sills. Owners often discovered that within a few short years, what had seemed like a brand new vehicle was already riddled with rust patches, bubbling paint, and structural weaknesses. A car that was meant to represent modern reliability instead looked like it had survived decades of abuse before it had even left the dealer lot. This corrosion problem wasn't just cosmetic. It compromised suspension mounting points, weakened the body structure, and made even minor collisions more dangerous. Mechanical failures were equally relentless. The Aspen's engines, transmissions, and fuel systems were notoriously temperamental. Carburetors sometimes exploded due to fuel leaks, leaving owners with both mechanical headaches and fire hazards. Steering components failed unexpectedly, brakes were inconsistent, and the ignition system often suffered from premature wear. The car's suspension, while initially competent, quickly showed signs of sagging or misalignment due to poor manufacturing tolerances. Owners regularly reported stalling, overheating, and other malfunctions that turned routine commuting into a gamble. Federal regulators took notice. The Aspen became one of the era's more heavily recalled vehicles, with fixes issued for everything from steering assemblies to fuel system hazards. Driving one required constant vigilance, as even a short journey could involve sudden, unpredictable failures. Handling and driving dynamics were unremarkable at best, dangerous at worst. The Aspen chassis, derived from older platforms, was prone to understeer in corners and unstable in emergency maneuvers. The brakes, particularly on early models, were underpowered relative to the car's weight, leading to long stopping distances. On wet or icy roads, the combination of compromised suspension geometry, weak brakes, and worn tires often turned the car into an unpredictable hazard. Drivers who tried to push the Aspen for fun were quickly reminded that it was built with expedience and cost-cutting in mind, not safety or performance. Even the interior, which could have been a redeeming feature, suffered from poor materials and assembly. Seats were uncomfortable, trim rattled incessantly, and dashboard components were prone to warping or cracking. A vehicle designed to be a modern, practical compact car instead felt cheap and fragile, constantly reminding owners that every panel, every connection, and every bolt was subject to failure. Owner accounts reflect frustration, exasperation, and disbelief. One recalled, "It felt like every week there was a new thing to fix. Steering, brakes, carburetor, you name it. Driving it was like a game of roulette." Another added, "We bought it for reliability and economy, but within a year it looked like it had been through 10 winters. Rust everywhere, parts falling off. It was humiliating." Even the station wagon variants, often marketed to families, were unsafe and inconvenient, as the rear suspension sagged under load, creating handling problems while the body deteriorated. The Dodge Aspen ultimately stands as a cautionary tale of Detroit at its nadir, a car that tried to meet modern expectations without investing in the engineering, materials, or quality control necessary to succeed. It encapsulated the worst aspects of the malaise era: rushed production, cost-cutting, and an over-reliance on marketing to disguise mediocrity. While some collectors today may look back on the Aspen with a quirky fondness, recognizing it as part of Dodge's complex history, there's no denying that for its original buyers, it was a relentless source of disappointment, expense, and sometimes danger. In essence, the 1975 Dodge Aspen was a car of contradictions, intended to be modern, efficient, and reliable, yet delivering rust, mechanical chaos, and regulatory intervention. It represented ambition strangled by execution, style undermined by substance, and optimism crushed by reality. It was Detroit at its lowest, a car that promised a new beginning and instead left drivers navigating a minefield of recalls, repairs, and frustration. A cautionary chapter in the history of American compact cars. The 1959 Edsel Ranger was the final faltering echo of one of the most notorious failures in American automotive history. By that year, the Edsel brand had already earned a place in infamy, a cautionary tale of ambition, overconfidence, and the perils of corporate hubris. Ford had poured enormous resources into creating what it hoped would be a revolutionary new marque, targeting buyers who wanted something stylish, innovative, and different from Chevrolet or Pontiac. Instead, it produced a car that was heavy, ungainly, and divisive, leaving the Ranger to limp through the marketplace as a symbol of how not to build or market a car. Visually, the 1959 Ranger tried to stand out, but the execution was disastrous. The so-called horse-collar grille, intended to be bold and distinctive, was widely reviled, instantly marking the car as a target for ridicule. Designers had attempted to combine futuristic flair with traditional luxury cues, but the result was a confused, awkward aesthetic. The body itself was enormous and heavy, with long lines that, rather than appearing sleek, only emphasized its bulk. Chrome trim was overdone, taillights were oddly shaped, and proportions were off. The Ranger had a look that was meant to convey sophistication, but instead appeared almost cartoonish. In an era when mid-century Americans prized both elegance and style, the Edsel Ranger's appearance made it a punchline before anyone even turned the key. Under the hood, the Ranger offered engines similar to other Ford products, V8 options designed to move the car with reasonable authority. But the weight of the vehicle, combined with mediocre handling and suspension tuning, meant that acceleration felt sluggish and steering was vague. The long wheelbase, which could have offered comfort, instead amplified body roll and corners, making the car feel less stable than its size suggested. Drivers quickly discovered that it was neither nimble nor particularly satisfying to drive, a heavy, lumbering machine that required careful handling and constant attention. Brakes, while adequate for city speeds, struggled to provide confidence in emergency stops, further diminishing the car's appeal. Inside, the Ranger was overstuffed with features meant to impress: chrome accents, two-tone upholstery, and a wide array of dashboard instruments. Ford even touted advanced innovations like the TeleTouch push-button transmission in some models, which promised futuristic convenience. In reality, these systems were complicated, prone to malfunction, and confusing to drivers who expected straightforward operation. The interior, while spacious, lacked cohesion and refinement. The sheer bulk of the vehicle made everything feel cumbersome, and minor quality issues were apparent in early production units. Owner experiences from the era highlight the deep frustration and disappointment. One recalled, "It looked like a star on the lot, but driving it felt like steering a battleship." The fancy transmission buttons were more trouble than they were worth, and everywhere you went, people were laughing at the grille.
Another noted, "Ford tried to sell us innovation, but it felt like a gimmick. The car was heavy, slow to respond, and constantly needed attention. Owning an Edsel was exhausting and embarrassing." In many ways, the Edsel Ranger exemplified the disconnect between corporate ambition and practical execution. Ford wanted to make a car that would dominate the market, but they misunderstood both consumer desires and the limitations of their own engineering. By 1959, the Edsel brand's fate was sealed. Sales had collapsed, dealers were frustrated, and the model lineup was increasingly seen as a liability rather than a product line with potential. The Ranger, as one of the last models produced, carried the weight of the brand's failure. It became a symbol not just of Ford's miscalculations, but of the era's dangers of over-engineering, poor marketing, and attempting to force innovation where the market wasn't ready. In retrospect, the 1959 Edsel Ranger stands as a monument to what happens when corporate ambition, poor timing, and bad design collide. It was heavy, awkward, and visually contentious, a car that tried to impress but instead repelled buyers. The horse-color grille, the overcomplicated features, the lack of cohesive design language, and the uninspiring driving dynamics all combined to make it one of the most infamous vehicles of the 20th century. While some collectors today view Edsels with curiosity and even affection, the Ranger remains a stark reminder of a colossal misstep in American automotive history, a car that promised revolution but delivered ridicule, failure, and a permanent place in the annals of corporate overreach. The 1983 Pontiac Phoenix was envisioned as a modern, efficient, and stylish compact car intended to rejuvenate Pontiac's image at a time when the American automotive industry was struggling to compete with increasingly refined Japanese imports. Pontiac chose the name Phoenix deliberately, evoking the mythological bird that rises reborn from its own ashes, a bold statement for a brand seeking to reinvent itself amidst fuel crises, tightening emission standards, and shifting consumer tastes. Unfortunately, the vehicle's reality could not have been more opposite to the optimism suggested by its name. From the moment it rolled off the assembly line, the Phoenix became emblematic of Detroit's early 1980s malaise, combining ambitious marketing with engineering shortcuts that would soon alienate drivers and critics alike. Built on the GM's J platform, the Phoenix shared its underlying structure with a host of other GM compacts, including the Chevrolet Cavalier, Oldsmobile Forenza, and Buick Skyhawk. While the platform was technically forward-looking for the time, offering front-wheel drive, independent front suspension, and a more compact footprint than older rear-wheel drive sedans, Pontiac's execution left much to be desired. The chassis was stiff in some areas and weak in others, producing unpredictable handling characteristics. Drivers frequently reported that the Phoenix exhibited abrupt understeer in corners, light oversteer during sudden maneuvers, and a general lack of road feel that made even routine driving a cautious affair. The car's lightweight frame, coupled with front-wheel drive torque steer on V6 models, made acceleration jerky and uneasy, particularly in wet conditions. For a car meant to be modern, efficient, and reliable, it felt precariously unrefined on any road that wasn't perfectly flat. Mechanically, the Phoenix suffered from a litany of serious issues that earned it a reputation for unreliability and danger. Transmissions, especially the automatic units, were prone to catastrophic failure, sometimes locking up entirely or slipping unpredictably. Oil leaks were widespread, creating not only maintenance headaches but actual fire hazards when oil contacted hot engine components. Cooling systems, fuel delivery systems, and electrical components were all prone to failure, meaning that a Phoenix owner could never take a drive without a lingering anxiety about whether the car would reach its destination intact. Some early owners described the Phoenix as a car that required constant babysitting, with oil checks, fluid top-offs, and wiring inspections becoming daily rituals rather than routine maintenance. The interior of the Phoenix compounded its woes. Designed to maximize space within a compact footprint, the cabin was functional but uninspired. Materials were cheap and often poorly fitted, with dashboard panels, door trims, and seat assemblies prone to rattling, warping, or outright breaking under minimal stress. Vinyl seats lacked support, and the HVAC system was notoriously weak, leaving drivers either freezing in winter or baked alive in summer.
Even in longer trips, the Phoenix failed to deliver comfort or refinement, and the overall tactile experience reinforced the sense that the car had been engineered primarily to meet regulatory requirements and cost constraints, not to satisfy drivers. Reliability and maintenance issues were severe enough to attract government scrutiny. GM issued multiple recalls for the Phoenix, addressing everything from defective steering components to oil leaks and overheating concerns. Some early models were even prone to spontaneous fires, an astonishing failure for a car intended as a safe, reliable compact for families. For owners, the Phoenix quickly became less a vehicle and more a project, a constant source of anxiety, mechanical headaches, and financial strain. One contemporary reviewer described it bluntly as a car whose only rising from the ashes is the stack of repair bills on the garage floor, while another lamented, "Pontiac promised a rebirth. All we got was a slow descent into frustration and expense." On the road, the Phoenix's flaws manifested in ways that could be alarming. Steering was imprecise and vague at highway speeds, brakes were soft and required long distances to stop the car effectively, and the combination of a light body and front heavy weight distribution made the vehicle feel unstable during sudden maneuvers. The four-cylinder engine struggled with acceleration, particularly under full passenger or cargo loads, while the optional V6 offered only marginal improvement. Drivers quickly realized that city driving was challenging enough, and highway trips required constant vigilance, particularly in adverse weather or traffic conditions. Despite its name and marketing, the Phoenix became emblematic not of rebirth, but of Detroit's struggles to adapt to new consumer expectations. It embodied the era's compromises: emissions controls sapping engine output, cost-cutting measures undermining quality control, and rushed platform sharing producing vehicles that looked modern but performed inadequately. Critics and consumers alike recognized the irony immediately. A car called Phoenix that seemed incapable of rising above mediocrity, much less surviving a single decade without expensive maintenance. Pontiac had tried to project an image of innovation and renewal, but the Phoenix instead highlighted the brand's vulnerability and the limits of GM's quality control at the time. Owner stories from the early 1980s convey a mix of humor, horror, and resignation. One recalled, "I named mine Ashes because it never stopped leaking oil long enough to see anything else." Another said, "I thought I bought a modern, efficient compact. What I got was an automotive Rube Goldberg machine that broke in ways I didn't even know a car could." Collectively, these accounts paint a portrait of a car that promised convenience and practicality, but delivered unpredictability, expense, and occasional danger. Even today, the Phoenix stands as a case study in the perils of marketing over-engineering, a cautionary tale that illustrates how a name, no matter how hopeful, cannot mask fundamental design and execution flaws. Pontiac had tried to project an image of innovation and renewal, but the Phoenix instead highlighted the brand's vulnerability and the limits of GM's quality control at the time. The 1974 AMC Matador Coupe was AMC's ambitious attempt to enter the burgeoning personal luxury and muscle car market, aiming squarely at Chevrolet's Monte Carlo and Ford's Torino. On paper, the Matador promised style, power, and a modern flair that could compete with the Detroit heavyweights. In reality, the car was a study in how corporate ambition, limited resources, and questionable design choices can combine to produce something both awkward and unreliable. AMC wanted to craft a vehicle that looked sleek, sporty, and aggressive, yet the final design resembled a vehicle caught mid-melt, its lines exaggerated in awkward ways that often provoked more laughter than admiration. Its proportions, a long, heavy front end paired with a stubby rear, made the coupe look like it had been stretched unevenly across the assembly line, and the massive grille and oversized taillights only amplified its visual imbalance. Underneath the unusual styling, the Matador Coupe struggled to deliver performance. The standard engines, usually AMC's inline-6 or modest V8 options, were underpowered for the car's relatively heavy frame, leading to sluggish acceleration and unenthusiastic driving dynamics. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than handling, but even then it performed poorly. The heavy front end caused excessive body roll in corners, and steering was vague and unresponsive, making precise driving at higher speeds a challenge. On tight curves or wet roads, the car often felt unstable,
a trait that became particularly problematic for fleet vehicles, such as police units that briefly experimented with the Matador before abandoning it in frustration. Safety and structural integrity were also areas of concern. The coupe's body was not especially rigid, and AMC's cost-cutting measures meant that certain panels and components were thin or prone to flexing. Police reports from the time indicated that the car's heavy nose and fragile midsection contributed to handling difficulties and could exacerbate collisions, making it a less than ideal choice for high-speed pursuits. Brakes were adequate for casual driving, but struggled to halt the vehicle quickly under stress, a combination that left drivers wary of pushing the car too hard. The interior reflected the same mix of ambition and compromise. While it attempted to emulate luxury trends with vinyl seats, wood grain trim, and a tidy dashboard layout, the materials were cheap and easily worn. Rattles were common, and the ergonomics often left controls awkwardly placed. Owner impressions mirrored the vehicle's shortcomings, with a mix of frustration and dark humor. One recalled, "It looked like it had been dragged across a sidewalk while someone stretched it with a hammer. Driving it was a lesson in humility and patience." Another driver noted, "The engine felt like it was trying its best, but the car just laughed at it. On the highway it wobbled and rolled. In corners it felt like it might just fold in half." Even those who appreciated AMC's intentions found themselves exasperated by the Matador Coupe's inability to deliver the combination of style, performance, and reliability promised in marketing materials. Fleet buyers, particularly police departments, quickly discovered the coupe's flaws in real-world conditions. While AMC pitched it as a potential patrol vehicle, the car's handling, braking, and acceleration left officers frustrated and wary, especially during high-speed maneuvers. Its massive nose created weight distribution problems, and under hard acceleration or emergency braking, the chassis and suspension revealed their weaknesses. Maintenance was another headache, as parts were less standardized than with Detroit competitors, and the quality of assembly introduced early mechanical failures. Despite its many flaws, the Matador Coupe occupies a unique place in automotive history. It stands as a reminder of AMC's ambition and willingness to challenge the Big Three, even if resources and engineering capabilities fell short. Its styling, while often mocked, has a certain kitschy charm in retrospect, emblematic of a time when personal luxury coupes were expected to look bold and aggressive, even if the results were less than graceful. The 1974 AMC Matador Coupe is remembered as a car that tried to do too much with too little, a vehicle whose intentions were high, whose execution was uneven, and whose combination of awkward design, mediocre performance, and questionable structural integrity made it one of the most unintentionally comedic and frustrating cars of the decade. It is a cautionary tale of ambition outpacing capability, but also a quirky artifact of AMC's willingness to take risks in an era dominated by Detroit's larger, more polished offerings.